Well, I'll just kick off. It's lovely. Thanks for coming, everyone. I've watched a few of the talks online, so it's nice to have an opportunity to share my experience of life in the order. Well, I guess a little bit before, but yeah, entering the order and subsequent times. Yeah, so I'll just kick off. So yeah, I've written a talk, so I'll read it, but yeah, see how we go. So the word dukkha is a very important one in Buddhism. Usually the word is translated as suffering, but dukkha's root meaning is not fitting well or standing badly. It can also mean difficulty and unease. And when I was a young man, this is what I felt within myself and what I felt when I looked out into the world around me. And this is what drove me to Buddhism. I was 19 years old at the time at university, and I was training to become a primary school teacher, and I ended up attending a Buddhist group there. The lady running the group mentioned the Four Noble Truths on my first visit, and I immediately felt a sense of great relief when I heard about the Four Noble Truths. The Buddha's unambiguous statement in the first truth as being that our world is tied to suffering immediately made me feel that he was honest. And the following three truths gave me a sense of hope and energy, realizing there was something I could do about my situation. Later, when I read a statement in one of Sangharakshita's books, The Three Jewels, I felt like he put into words what I felt about the Dharma on that occasion. In reality, he says, Buddhism is neither pessimistic nor optimistic. If compelled to label it at all, we should borrow a word from George Eliot and call it melioristic. For though asserting that conditioned existence is suffering, it also maintains, as the third Aryan truth teaches, that suffering can be transcended. So meliorism is the notion that the world can be improved through human effort, and through practicing the Dharma, even transcended. I think this maybe also explains the reason why I've never felt particularly pious or even religious, because I find it more useful to produce something through activity rather than hope something or someone will come and save me. Of course, I also started reading books about Buddhism at that time. One book that impressed me was called A Meditator's Diary, a Western Woman's Unique Experiences in Thailand Monasteries by Jane Hamilton Merritt. That's the book there. She wrote that in 1976, and her book interested me because it was written about her personal experience, and I became keen to learn Buddhist meditation as a result. One time I attended the Buddhist group at university. Sila Dasa had been invited to give a talk there on the life of the Buddha, although he wasn't ordained at that time. From him I learned about another group running classes in Brunswick called the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. So I started attending classes there at the end of 1989, and that of course, we changed our name to become the Triratna Buddhist Order later on. I soon met the guys living in the men's residential community a few streets away. And one night I was walking to the class through a laneway with an order member called Gunapala, and I asked him why he wasn't leading a monk's life. He replied that he felt like he already had everything he needed living how he was, and this really struck me. So his answer gave me some idea of what Sangharakshita's approach offered, that one could practice the Dharma and make real progress in any situation. It wasn't the lifestyle that dictated the outcome. A few years ago, a friend of mine who is a monk in the Thai forest tradition invited me to stay at the monastery where he lives in Thailand. So I went there for a few weeks and joined in with their lifestyle. It struck me during my stay that monastics emphasize what we call the going forth, or the renunciation of worldly existence, whereas Sangharakshita emphasizes going for refuge. Both terms imply each other, but I feel the emphasis on going for refuge is broader and positive, principally in being open to growing into something bigger rather than the leaving behind or the giving up. Not that these aren't also crucial aspects of practice. So by the early 1990s, I knew I was a Buddhist and had already made some changes to my life. I established a regular meditation practice, became vegetarian, stopped drinking alcohol for a year, and moved into the men's community and helped support the classes and courses being run there. Some highlights of those days were the Monday night men's study group with Buddhadasa. I found it very inspiring studying the Dharma with him, hearing stories about his friendship with Sangharakshita and getting to know the other men in the group. The openness of communication was something I'd not experienced much before. Also, moving into the men's community was a great experience for me. I felt like I made a lot of progress in that year. And for me, the memories of that time are filled with light and imagination. Those in the community at the time were Buddhadasa, Guyavadra, Padmasiddhi, and Scott Hilliard, and we all got on very well together. It was probably the most harmonious community I've ever lived in. And that would have been in, I think, 1991 or 92. At that time, there were more opportunities in our movement in England. So I moved to Cambridge to join the gift business run by the movement called Windhorse Trading. Shortly before leaving, I'd asked for ordination and I did a month's solitary to deepen my practice. I camped in the bush in some hills outside Warburton and enjoyed meditating, reading and reflecting. One nice thing was the lyrebirds performing their mimic calls of car alarms and chainsaws by my tent. I like to think that afterwards they were mimicking me reciting the sevenfold puja. Just as he introduced me to the movement in Melbourne, Siladasa also introduced me to the movement in England, for which I'll always be grateful. He was back working there for a time and collected me from Heathrow Airport. And he and his partner at the time, Catherine, put me up in their flat for the first few days of my arrival. I remember Catherine asking me if I regarded my move to England as a going forth. I can remember feeling like I wasn't giving anything up, but was rather gaining everything. I guess it was more an occasion of sensing a great opportunity and taking it. I ended up spending 7 years in Cambridge, and while I did feel like I gained an incredible amount, I also felt like I gave a lot to the movement during my years there. If I had anything in my 20s at all, it was energy, and I really gave all my energy to the movement then, principally through working in the business, which was generating money to expand the movement. The vision of the business was to operate what we called a team-based right livelihood, creating a viable commercial enterprise in line with Buddhist principles where the work becomes the practice. The idea was that the business also sat within the context of a holistic Buddhist lifestyle. That is, we all lived in residential communities, worked together in the business, and attended the local Buddhist centre. This is what we used to call the 3 C's, or the centre, co-op and community. It was an intensive environment based around Buddhist values. We endeavoured to live by the principle of give what you can and take what you need. And financially, this meant working for pocket money rather than a wage. After 7 years in England, my bank account, really a moth's nest, had remained exactly the same as when I arrived. I first worked in the warehouse there for a year, but afterwards spent the remaining years working on the van sales team, both as a salesman and as a manager. The vans, as we called them, was a demanding job which entailed a cycle of 3 days making appointments with customers on the phone, a day loading up some stock, and then 6 days driving around a set area of the UK, distributing stock and taking orders for customers. It was demanding because you were on your own. It was very busy. There was lots of driving and navigating, lots of communication with people, negotiating sales and making new contacts. But it was also a great adventure, and I still have close connections with a customer from those days, and of course my fellow team members. It was also an excellent way for me to experience the UK, and I did van runs through all of Scotland, England, and also Ireland as well. So not just the UK. It was also a great way for me to experience the wider Buddhist movement in the UK, as I would often stay in Buddhist communities or with order members and friends when I was out on the road. To give you a sense of the variety, I stayed with Subhadra, who lived on his own in a cottage in a tiny Welsh village. Then the men's community above the large warehouse that was converted into the Buddhist centre in the heart of Manchester, to staying with Mangala in the seedy red light district of Liverpool. There were always stories after a week on the road, and the salesmen would always meet up late at night after the week finished when we returned to Cambridge to share our stories and hang out together. I also attended the series of retreats prescribed as part of the training to become an order member. These were always challenging but rewarding. They were formative in terms of practice and building friendships and connections. After a few years, I was invited to attend the 4-month ordination retreat at Guyaloca in Spain. It was a strong experience that brought challenges, but also a deep experience of the timeless sense of engaging in practice alongside others. Set in a valley in mountains in the southeast, we dressed in robes, away from the trappings of the world, and I remember thinking that with all external references removed, this could be taking place at any time in history, and I found them profoundly simple and noble days. Like Padmasiddhi on that retreat, I was ordained by Buddhadasa in a simple, moving ceremony. By the end of the retreat, it was dry and hot, and some friends drove me down to the Mediterranean. It was amazing to swim out into the ocean after months inside the valley. When I returned to Cambridge, I went back to working on the vans initially and then managed a team for the last 2 years of my stay. I returned to Melbourne for the start of the new millennium at the beginning of 2000. I wanted to give something back to the Sangha here. So I helped start a right. I learned about the business from a Mitra, now an order member, who was running her own similar business in Sydney. I really struggled with the business, which ran for almost 4 years. We had successes, but never really established ourselves. And eventually I was worn out and needed to stop. It was a really difficult time for me. When I moved back to Australia, I began to write to Sangharakshita. And in that time, we developed a good correspondence. I wrote to him at one point about my struggles with the business and mentioned that I thought the difficulties all had to do with me and no one else. He wrote back saying that he agreed. I have often remembered his remark and took it to mean that one should not blame others for one's problems. I didn't then, and I still don't always succeed in this, but I do try my best to live in this way. Failing at something or something not working out as you planned is unpleasant, but it's not all bad. It throws you back on your own resources. Although it reveals shortcomings, it can also help you to clarify values. For me, I never regretted the effort I made, but I would do it differently if I had my time again. The main change I'd make would be to find a friend who was a peer who shared the same vision to work with before beginning. I found people to share it with along the way, but it was maybe too late by then. During the first 4 years back in Melbourne, I really still lived my life within the overarching vision of the 3 Cs. I worked in a business I hoped would make money for our movement and provide a context where people could work and practice together. I lived in a residential community with other Buddhists, and I also gave a lot to the centre in terms of helping run classes and courses. But after closing the business, I felt the need to have a change and find a different perspective on things. At the time, I felt the only way to do this was to distance myself from the movement, as I felt to some extent I'd become a little dependent upon it. After all, I was pretty young when I came along and had really grown up within the context of the institution, and I wanted to explore beyond it. For my self-confidence, I felt like I needed to develop a way of supporting myself with a livelihood I was interested in and was in line with my values. My orientation to practicing the Dharma never wavered, so although I struggled with confidence in many ways, at least I always had that grounding. Having an excellent companion in Rijamai, good friends and hard work took care of the rest. After some blind alleyways, I eventually combined my practical hand skills with an interest in art and trained as a paper conservator, finding work in labs in Adelaide, the National Library in Canberra, and now at the University of Melbourne. During those years, I helped Ratnadaka start classes in Adelaide and then helped run a small group in Canberra. In the last few years, I've devoted a lot of energy into trying to improve and clarify my practice, particularly with regards to meditation. Part of this has involved semi-regular discussion and interviews with Bodhi Ketu at Adhisthana and Riju Mitra at Vajraloka. My chapter and the order members I interact with most in terms of personally discussing and exploring my practice are mainly those I was ordained with, so that connection remains important to me. Seeing my partner, Rijamai, enter the order was also a very special event, and I have to acknowledge her massive contribution and support for my own practice over the last 17 years. I think it can be difficult to gain an appreciation of what the term going for refuge means in practical terms. At least that's my experience of it. Sangharakshita talks of it as being the central Buddhist act. It's what defines one as a Buddhist. But trying to work out what it is in the rough and tumble of one's own life can at times be daunting and confusing. But it can only be worked out through being lived. One time I was at a reunion dinner with the men I was ordained with, and Sangharakshita was sitting at the head of the table. I was down the other end of the table to him, and at some point I drifted away from the conversation. I was reflecting about being ordained with these guys and our connection, but then a strong urge entered my mind, and it was a strong desire to gain enlightenment, to overcome suffering and become free. As the conversation flowed on around me, I became absorbed in this thought more and more, and then became aware that someone was looking at me. I turned my head and Sangharakshita's full attention was focused on me. It was as if he knew my thought and his look acknowledged my desire. I felt encouraged that my going for refuge had been witnessed. And when we practice together, this is something that all of us do for each other. So that's the end of it.